Hi there. This video tutorial will review 3 different monotype techniques that you can use to create fabric swatches. These techniques are magazine transfers, botanical printing, and textures and painting. So before you begin, there are a couple things that you will want to consider. First, it's important to know the difference between a monotype and a monoprint. A monotype is something that is unique and is always one of one, whereas a monoprint is something that is meant to be created in a series and typically has a repeated element that goes throughout the set of prints that you make. So because yours are unique, you'll want to consider the colors that you'll use in your print. It's good to have contrasting colors that are either light and dark value colors or colors that are complementary. You also want to think about how you're going to use those colors in your work and choose colors that meet the goal of your concept or your end result. I like to come up with a set of colors that are unified, so even though my prints are all different, there's a consistent look among each of those. So yours might be different depending on what your end goal is. The first technique that we're going to see is a magazine transfer. So for this, you're going to need a jelly plate, some acrylic paint, a brayer, some muslin, and magazine pages. For the magazine, I find that glossier pages work better. Usually find these in fashion magazines. My first step is to take my acrylic paint and I'm spreading it out in a relatively thin layer on my plate. So usually like a nickel size amount of paint works best for this. I'm putting my image face down on my jelly plate and then just lightly burnishing the back for 15 seconds. And then I'm going to pull up my paper, and underneath all of the black from my magazine page has resisted that ink and it remains on my plate. I'm going to let that dry, and then here I'm taking my second color of paint. Usually you want a contrasting color for this so you can see your image a bit better. And I'm spreading that out in another thin layer of paint. You can get away with a little bit more paint with this one, but you still want to keep it relatively thin. You should be able to see parts of your darker color through this layer of paint. And then once that's spread out pretty evenly and it's consistent across the plate, you're going to then take your muslin and lay it over top. And then just lightly burnish it. I like to do this with the back of my hand first, and then I'll get some scrap magazine paper and lay it over top to catch all the excess, and then I can use a little bit more pressure and burnish it for about 15 seconds or so. I'm going to let that dry a bit. I like to wait 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'm going to carefully pull that back. It wants to stick to the plate a little bit more after this amount of time because the paint is relatively dry, but you can see it's lifting all of that paint off of the surface of my plate. And then I have a really nicely contrasted image. I feel like this takes a lot of experimentation with it to get a good pool, so you'll need to play around. The next technique we're going to look at is botanical printing. So for this, you'll need a lot of similar materials: your jelly plate, some acrylic paint, a brayer, muslin, and then your found objects are your botanicals. These could be real or fake, but you should have a variety of them. What I'm doing here is just placing them on my jelly plate in an interesting composition, and we're going to use these like a stencil. So once they're laid out on the plate, I'm going to put my paint out on just a scrap magazine page. You can use a bench hook. And then I'm just holding onto them and rolling over top. And that's going to leave a negative space image of my botanical objects. And now what I'm doing is I'm using a reductive technique to remove some of that paint from my plate. So I'm just taking it and smushing it on top. I let that layer dry. You could print right away if you want to, but I want a two-tone effect here. So I'm going over top with a thin layer of paint, and then I'm going to place my fabric over top and do my pool. So the same kind of technique as last time. I gently spread it out with my fingers and burnish the back, and then I'm going to take that scrap magazine page, a little bit more pressure, and then I'll pull this one. So I pulled this right away. I didn't really wait for any dry time in between. And I'm going to layer more pieces over top of that same print. So the nice thing I think about monotypes is you can do a lot of layering, and you have control over where things are going to go in those subsequent layers. So for this one, I'm rolling my paint directly onto that leaf there, and I'm using it like a stamp. So with this, I have some control over where I'm placing it, and I can see a ghost image of my previous print underneath. So I have an idea about where these are going to show up on my print when I reprint it. And I'll just try to align it in relatively the same area as before. And then I'll get that second layer on there. So again, lay it over top. Lightly burnish the back. I don't have too much excess this time, so I'm just using my hands to do that. And then I do my pull. Our final technique is texture and painting. So we're going to need our same materials plus some paint scrapers, some bubble wrap, and some brushes. For this, you could generally use any mark making tools as long as they're soft because you don't want to damage your plate. So I'm taking my craft paint, I'm spreading it out over my plate. See, I have a little residual left from my former pool, which I tend to like because I feel like it gives your print a little bit more texture. So I'm taking my paint scraper and I'm removing some of that paint from my plate. You can get some really cool designs, and you could use different kinds of scrapers to get different kind of patterns. I'm laying my muslin over top and burnishing it before I pull my print. And here I get that lovely texture over top of previous pull that I did. What I did after this is I used that leftover ghost print to pull a second print and add it on top of that. So these are fun to use as ghost prints as well for your next print. So for this one, I'm using some bubble wrap, and you can use textures like this as additive textures or subtractive textures. So with this, I'm rolling out the paint directly on the plate, and then I'm removing it with the bubble wrap, and then I come back and add on top of it with what's left over on my bubble wrap. So you can get a really kind of positive and negative looking design on your print. And I'm taking a couple different colors of paint, give it a little bit more color change there, and I'm laying my muslin over top. This tends to go through a little bit more because I have a little bit more paint on there, so you want to use your extra magazine page to catch all that. And then I'm going to pull my print, and you can see that difference in texture between the positive and negative kind of look there. Now for this one, I have little jelly plates. These are nice because you can kind of control where your print's going to go a little bit better, and they come in all different shapes. You could use really anything for this too. You could use plexi, glass. So I like to use these for all of the techniques I would use on the bigger plate, but now I can have, that outside pattern, that outside shape, and I could layer these on top of one another as well. The last thing I wanted to show you is painting directly onto the plate. What I like about monotypes is they are very painterly, a painterly way of printing. So these are nice if you want a little bit more refinement in your print. So you can take your time with these. This is time lapse, but it maybe took me about 5 to 10 minutes to paint this on. And what I'm going to do after I finish painting my design on there is I'm going to let it dry. So if I tried to pull this print now, I would have dried areas and wet areas. So I want to let that all dry, and then I'm going to coat it with just a light coating of paint on the back there. And then I have a little string there for some resist. And I'm going to pull my print, and you can see because I have let that first layer dry and then put my wet layer on, it's grabbing all of that previous painting. So this is nice for a little bit more detail. You just want to keep in mind that it will be in reverse when you pull it, which is really important if you're doing words or anything like that. So here are some examples of my finished prints. So let's pick a technique to get started and have fun.